Caleb Whitmore knew the language of silence. It was spoken by the wind that swept down from the Rockies, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. It was in the steady, patient gaze of his cattle and the creak of the floorboards in the cabin his father had built with his own 2 hands. For 5 years, since his PA had been laid to rest on the rise overlooking the creek, silence had been his only steady companion. It was a language he had come to understand, but it had finally started to say things he did not want to hear, lonely things, hollow things. That was why he'd done it. A trip into the town of Harmony Creek, a visit to the telegraph office, a carefully worded advertisement sent to a matrimonial newspaper back east. Homestead rancher, 34, sober and hard-working, seeks a plain and honest woman for marriage. No frills required, only a sturdy heart and a willingness to share a hard life. He'd felt a hot flush of shame as he'd paid the clerk, as if he were admitting a personal failure, a weakness the land itself would despise. 2 months later, the letters came, not 1, but 2, arriving on the same weekly mail coach. He'd held them in his calloused hands, the paper feeling unnervingly delicate. One was addressed in a flowing, elegant script, the envelope thick and smelling faintly of lavender. The other was penned in a scrabbled, forceful hand on cheaper paper, the ink slightly blotted. He had read them both by the light of a kerosene lamp, his brow furrowed in confusion. Mrs. Evelyn Winslow of Boston wrote of her desire for a quiet life, away from the painful memories of a past she wished to leave behind. Her words were proper, measured, speaking of companionship and mutual respect. She mentioned her skills in running a household and her belief in the sanctity of a Christian home. She would be arriving on the Tuesday coach in 3 weeks' time. Miss Lottie Ray of the Missouri backwoods wrote with a bluntness that startled him. Her father was dead. Her brothers had scattered, and she had no prospects beyond working her fingers to the bone for pennies. She wrote, "I am not plain, but I am strong. I can cook and clean and mend a fence. I do not need frills. I need a start. I will work as hard as any man." She too would be arriving, though she gave no exact date, only that she would be there before the first deep snow. Caleb had stared at the letters, then at the copy of his advertisement. 1 ad, 1 man, 2 women, both believing they were chosen. A mistake, then a terrible, costly mistake made by some clerk 1,000 miles away. His first instinct was to ride into town and wire them both, tell them not to come, but the first was already on her way. And the second, how could he send a message to a girl who had no fixed address, who was likely already walking west? He sat in the silence of his cabin, the 2 letters on the table a testament to a mess he had no idea how to clean up. So he did what he had always done when faced with a problem he could not solve. He worked and he waited. The Tuesday coach arrived exactly on time, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on every soul standing in Harmony Creek's main street. Only 1 passenger disembarked. Caleb recognized her instantly from the description she'd given of her gray traveling suit. Mrs. Evelyn Winslow was a woman who did not belong here. Her posture was ramrod straight. Her gloves were immaculate, and the hat pinned to her carefully coiled dark hair was a small, defiant bastion of Eastern civility. She was in her 30s, with a face that was handsome rather than beautiful, marked by a sadness in her deep-set eyes that her polite smile could not quite hide. "Mr. Whitmore?" she asked, her voice softer than he expected, yet clear and steady. "Ma'am," he nodded, taking the single, fine leather trunk from the driver. He felt clumsy and oversized next to her, his work clothes smelling of hay and horse. He was acutely aware of the eyes on them, the curtain twitching in the window of the mercantile, the gossiping clutch of women pretending to inspect fabric bolts, the unblinking stare of Reverend Miller from the steps of his church. The ride out to the homestead was quiet. Evelyn looked at the vast, rugged landscape, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The land was not beautiful in the way of manicured Boston parks. It was raw, powerful, and utterly indifferent. His cabin, when they arrived, was even more of a shock to her system. It was sturdy, clean, and utterly devoid of comfort. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. "It's solid," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. She was a woman trained to please, to find the best in any situation, but her composure was being tested. "It keeps the winter out," Caleb replied simply. He showed her the small room he had hastily partitioned off for her, containing a narrow cot and a crate for her belongings. It was a paltry offering, but it was the best he could do. He watched as she placed her handbag on the cot, her movements precise and graceful, as if she were arranging flowers in a vase. She was like a delicate porcelain teacup set down in the middle of a blacksmith shop, and for 3 days, a strange, formal peace settled over the homestead. Evelyn proved true to her word. She was a miracle worker in the kitchen, turning his bland staples of salt pork and beans into savory stews. She mended his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She brought a quiet order to the cabin, a sense of home he had not realized he was missing. She spoke little of her past, and he did not ask. He just knew, from the way she flinched at loud noises and the haunted look that sometimes crossed her face, that she was running from something terrible. The peace was shattered on the 4th day. Caleb was splitting firewood when he saw the figure approaching on the dirt track that served as his road. It was a young woman, or maybe a girl, walking with a long, determined stride. She carried a battered suitcase that seemed to weigh more than she did. Her dress was faded calico, the hem caked with mud, and she was barefoot, her feet dusty and calloused. Her hair was a wild mane of sun-streaked brown, tied back with a piece of twine. She stopped a few feet from him, dropping the suitcase with a thud. She was younger than Evelyn, perhaps barely 20, with a smattering of freckles across her nose and eyes the color of a stormy sky. They held a look that was part defiance, part desperation. "You Caleb Whitmore?" she asked, her voice raspy from the road. Caleb leaned his axe against the chopping block. I'm Lottie Ray," she announced, squaring her thin shoulders. "Your bride." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. At that moment, the cabin door opened and Evelyn stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron she had fashioned from a flour sack. She froze, her eyes landing on the girl, then moving to Caleb's stunned face. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion. Then dawning horror. Lottie's gaze followed hers, and her defiant expression hardened into suspicion. "Who's she?" The silence that followed was broken only by the caw of a distant crow. It was a silence of a different kind, not peaceful, but charged, brittle, ready to break into 1,000 sharp pieces. Caleb felt a cold dread wash over him. He was a man who solved problems with his hands, by fixing a broken fence or calming a spooked horse. He had no tools for this. He cleared his throat, his own voice sounding foreign. "There's been a mistake." He explained it as best he could, the words coming out in a clumsy rush inside the suffocating smallness of the cabin. He showed them the 2 letters, the single advertisement. Lottie stood with her arms crossed, her jaw tight, suspicion warring with exhaustion on her young face. Evelyn had sunk into a chair, her hands trembling in her lap, her face pale as milk. All the careful grace, the practiced poise, had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, wounded vulnerability. "So you're saying," Lottie said, her voice sharp, "that you sent for one, and 2 showed up?" "It seems so," Caleb said quietly. "Well, I walked nigh on 200 miles to get here. I ain't walking back," Lottie declared, her chin jutting out. "I got nothing to go back to." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes pleading with Caleb. "Mr. Whitmore, what is to be done?" He looked from one to the other, at Evelyn, the refined widow, so clearly broken by a world of whispers and judgments, seeking a quiet refuge. At Lottie, the barefoot girl with nothing but grit, looking for a patch of earth to call her own. He saw the coming winter in the graying sky, felt the bite in the air that promised a hard season. To send either of them away was to sentence them to… what? He could not do it. "You can both stay," he said, the words feeling heavy as stones in his mouth. "For now. The weather's turning. No one's getting sent out into that." He looked at Evelyn's cot in the small, partitioned room. "I'll sleep in the barn. You two can have the cabin." He held up a hand to forestall their protests. "This was my mistake to fix. You'll have shelter and food, and I swear to you both, I'll make a choice. Soon. But I won't see a woman left to fend for herself on my account." The arrangement was a scandal waiting to happen, and it did not have to wait long. Harmony Creek was a town held together by two things: shared hardship and relentless gossip. The story of Caleb Whitmore and his two brides spread faster than a prairie fire. When Caleb rode in for supplies the following week, the whispers followed him like a swarm of flies. Women would stop talking when he entered the mercantile, only to resume their venomous chatter the moment he was out of earshot. Men would give him a sly grin and a knowing wink, a crude camaraderie that made his stomach turn. Reverend Miller cornered him outside the feed store, his face a mask of pious concern. "Caleb, my son, the Lord's house is built on the foundation of one man, one wife. What you are doing, it is an affront to God and this community. You are harboring sin under your roof." "I'm harboring two women who would freeze to death otherwise." "Reverend," Caleb said, his voice level, "the sin would be in turning them out." He loaded his wagon and left, the preacher's righteous glare boring into his back. Back at the homestead, an unspoken war had begun. It was a quiet, domestic battle fought with skillets and needlepoint on one side, and axes and buckets on the other. Evelyn, with a quiet determination, took over the cabin completely. The smell of baking bread now filled the small space, and she cooked meals that made Caleb realize how poorly he had been eating for years. She washed their clothes with a fierce energy, scrubbing them against the washboard until her soft hands were red and raw. She tried to bring a semblance of civilization to their lives, insisting they sit down for meals at the table, folding napkins, and speaking in quiet, proper tones. She was proving her worth as a wife, a keeper of the home. Lottie would have none of it. She saw the inside of the cabin as enemy territory. She was up before the sun, pulling on a pair of Caleb's old trousers she had cinched with a rope, and heading out to the barn. She worked with a wiry strength that amazed him. She learned to milk the cow, her movements at first clumsy but quickly becoming sure. She mucked out stalls, fed the chickens, and helped Caleb mend a sagging section of fence, holding the posts steady while he hammered, never once complaining about the splinters or the cold. She was proving her worth as a partner, a worker of the land. They barely spoke to each other. Their interactions were clipped, polite, and layered with ice. "Mrs. Winslow, the water bucket is full," Lottie would announce, leaving it by the door. "Miss Ray, supper is ready," Evelyn would call, never stepping foot outside if she could help it. Caleb was caught in the middle, a silent observer of their tense ballet. He found himself drawn to both, and the realization shamed him. He admired Evelyn's grace, the quiet dignity with which she bore her shame, sitting in the cabin in the evenings, the air warm and smelling of cinnamon. He felt a peace he had never known, but when he was outside, working alongside Lottie under the vast, open sky, feeling the burn of labor in his muscles, he felt a different kind of rightness. She understood the land, the unforgiving rhythm of it. She was not trying to tame it. She was trying to survive in it, just like him. Then the weather turned. The sky, which had been a moody gray for days, unleashed a fury that seemed biblical. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain. Within a day, the world beyond the homestead was gone, erased by a wall of white. The creek froze solid. The road to town vanished. The three of them were trapped, prisoners in the small cabin and the nearby barn. The confinement frayed their nerves raw. The polite distance they had maintained became impossible. Every movement, every breath, seemed to echo in the small space. A log shifting in the fireplace made them all jump. Lottie's habit of humming under her breath grated on Evelyn's nerves. Evelyn's constant. Quiet tidying made Lottie feel like a clumsy animal. One afternoon, Lottie came in from the barn, stamping snow from her boots. A small drift of it dusted the floor Evelyn had just swept. "Miss Ray," Evelyn said, her voice tight, "could you please be more careful?" Lottie straightened up, her eyes flashing. "I was just checking on the livestock. Mrs. Winslow, making sure they don't freeze to death. That's a little more important than a speck of dirt on your floor, ain't it?" "There is no reason one's circumstances must dictate one's manners," Evelyn retorted, her cheeks flushed. "And there's no use in good manners when a blizzard is trying to tear the roof off," Lottie shot back. "Enough." Caleb's voice cut through the tension, sharp and loud. Both women fell silent, looking at him with a mixture of surprise and resentment. He rarely raised his voice. He felt a wave of exhaustion. He was not a king judging two queens. He was just a man, trying to keep the peace in a tinderbox. The storm raged for 4 days. They were forced to rely on one another in a way that stripped away their pretense. When a section of the barn roof threatened to give way under the weight of the snow, all three of them worked together. Caleb on a ladder, Lottie and Evelyn below, bracing the beams with all their might, their faces grim in the flickering lantern light. They moved as a single unit, their animosity forgotten in the face of a shared threat. But once the danger passed, the silence and the tension returned, heavier than before. On the 5th night, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, and a profound, ringing silence fell over the snow-covered world. The moon rose in a clear, cold sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over the drifts that buried the fences and rose halfway up the cabin walls. Caleb, sleeping in the hayloft of the barn, found he could not rest. The quiet was more unsettling than the storm had been. He lay there, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the roof, the faces of the two women swimming in his mind. Evelyn, with her hidden sorrows and her desperate attempt to build a wall of civility around herself. Lottie, with her fierce pride and the hungry look of someone who had never been given a single thing she had not fought for. He had sworn to choose one. But how? How did a man choose between bread and water, between shelter and open sky? It was then that he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the vast stillness of the night. It came from the cabin, a soft, choked sound that drifted through the frigid air. Someone was crying. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, the kind of weeping a person only does when they believe no one in the world can hear them. He sat up, his heart clenching in his chest. Was it Evelyn, mourning the life of respectability she had lost forever? Or was it Lottie, finally letting the weight of her long, hard journey crush her? He listened, straining in the cold dark, but he could not tell. The sound was just a raw, human grief, stripped of any identity. He did not know which of them it was. And in that moment, he realized with a terrible certainty, it did not matter. Their pain sounded exactly the same. The sound of that solitary weeping haunted Caleb. It followed him into the cold light of day and stayed with him as he worked, a ghost of a sound that belonged to both women and neither. He could not ask who it was. The question itself felt like a violation, but he knew he could not let things continue as they were. The partitioned corner of the cabin was an indignity, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. He had timber his father had felled years ago, seasoned and stacked behind the barn. He had his tools. He would build them a proper room. For a week, the homestead echoed with the sound of saw and hammer. It was a clean, honest noise that temporarily drowned out the simmering tension. He worked from dawn till dusk, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was a capable builder, his movements economical and sure. Lottie watched him from the barn, a silent approval in her eyes. She recognized the language of hard, useful labor. Evelyn would bring him a tin cup of hot coffee in the afternoons, standing for a moment to observe his progress. Her expression unreadable. She understood the purpose of a home, the meaning of walls and a solid roof. When it was finished, the new room was an extension of the cabin, with 2 built-in bunks, a small window facing the sunrise, and a sturdy door. It was not fancy, but it was private. It was safe. "This is for you," he said to them, his voice rough with fatigue. "Both of you, for your dignity." Evelyn touched the smooth planed wood of the doorframe, her eyes welling with tears. Lottie just stared, her arms crossed, but her jaw was less tight than usual. That night, for the first time, Caleb slept in his own bed in the main cabin. The new door closed, separating him from the women. But instead of creating distance, the solid wall seemed to crumble an emotional one. The act of care had changed the air between them. A few nights later, a fierce wind rattled the window panes, moaning around the eaves of the cabin. Lottie was asleep, exhausted from a day of helping Caleb clear a snow-clogged animal path. Evelyn, however, sat by the low-burning fire, a mending basket untouched in her lap. Caleb watched her from his chair across the hearth. In the flickering light, the mask of polite composure she wore so diligently had slipped. "The wind sounds like a woman screaming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It used to frighten me. My husband, he did not like for me to show fear." Caleb said nothing, merely waited. He knew this was a threshold, and only she could choose to cross it. "Everyone in Boston thought him a saint," she continued, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Mr. Alistair Winslow, a man of wealth, of God, a pillar of the community. He was, in public," she took a shaky breath, "but behind closed doors, he was a different man. He enjoyed silence. If I spoke too much at dinner, or laughed too loudly, or expressed an opinion that was not his own, he would punish me with it. Days of silence. He would look through me as if I were a ghost in my own home. It was a cold, quiet cruelty that hollowed me out." She finally turned to look at Caleb, her eyes dark with the memory of it. "The loneliness of a crowded room is the most profound loneliness of all. Mr. Whitmore, he died of a fever, and everyone mourned the great man. I did not shed a tear. His family saw my dry eyes at the funeral and called me unnatural. Cold, that is the shame I ran from, not of his death, but of my relief." The confession hung in the warm, still air. Caleb saw her then not as a refined lady, but as a survivor of a war no one else had known she was fighting. "A man like that," he said, his voice low and steady, "doesn't deserve a single tear." Evelyn gave a small, shuddering sob, a sound of release, and for the first time since she had arrived, she looked at him without a guard around her heart. The next day, it was Lottie's turn. Caleb found her in the barn, currying the horse with rough, angry strokes. She had been quiet all morning, a thundercloud of a girl. He started to fork hay into the stalls, working beside her in the familiar quiet. "She thinks I'm just dirt," Lottie finally burst out, not looking at him. "Mrs. High and Mighty Winslow thinks 'cause I ain't got fine words or manners that I ain't got feelings." "She's had a hard life," Caleb offered gently. Lottie let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Hard? She don't know the meaning of the word. Hard is watching your ma cough her lungs out into a rag 'cause there ain't no money for a doctor. Hard is your PA drinking himself into the grave after. Hard is having a belly so empty, it feels like it's eating itself from the inside out." She stopped brushing the horse, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. Her voice dropped, becoming flat and cold. We had a neighbor, Mr. Abernathy, a farmer. He'd sometimes give me extra scraps for my younger brothers, always smiling, patting my head, a kind man. I thought. She swallowed hard. After Pa died, he came by one night, said he'd brought food. He trapped me in the pantry. He was big, and he smelled of sour whiskey. He told me what a good girl I was, and how I could be a real good girl now and make sure my brothers didn't starve. Caleb stopped his work. The pitchfork held rigid in his hands. He could feel the rage coiling in his gut, cold and deadly. I fought, Lottie said, her voice trembling with a fury that was years old. I bit him, kicked him. I grabbed a pickling crock and broke it over his head. Then I ran. I didn't even go back for my things. Just took what little money Ma had saved in a jar, and I started walking west. I heard he told everyone I tried to steal from him, that I was a wild, wicked thing. She finally turned to face Caleb, her stormy eyes blazing. So don't tell me about her hard life. She slept in a soft bed. I slept in ditches. With that, she slammed the brush down and fled the barn, leaving Caleb standing in the silence, her story a raw, open wound in the cold air. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The rivalry had not vanished, but something else was present, a fragile, unspoken recognition. When Lottie dropped her fork, Evelyn bent to pick it up without a word of reproach. When Evelyn shivered by the drafty window, Lottie tossed another log on the fire. They had each seen the other's scars, and in them, they caught a glimpse of their own. They were two different kinds of broken, but they were broken all the same. The thaw between them deepened during the great freeze. A cold snap descended that was so severe it felt like the world was holding its breath. The snow crunched like glass underfoot, and the air was sharp enough to cut. One of the new calves, born late in the season, had wandered from its mother and fallen into a shallow, ice-crusted ravine. Its frightened cries were thin and desperate. Caleb went out immediately, Lottie right behind him. Evelyn watched from the cabin doorway, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Caleb lowered himself into the ravine, speaking in a low, calming voice to the terrified animal. He was gentle, his large hands stroking the calf's neck, soothing its panic before he even tried to lift it. The calf was weak, its legs trembling. He finally managed to get a rope around its middle, and with Lottie pulling from above and him pushing from below, they managed to haul the small creature to safety. He carried the freezing animal into the barn, laying it on a bed of clean straw near the stove. He rubbed its limbs vigorously, forcing warmth and life back into them. He murmured to it the whole time, soft words of encouragement, the same way a father might speak to a sick child. Evelyn had followed them into the barn. She stood in the shadows, watching. She saw not just a rough cowboy, but a man of profound and patient tenderness, this quiet, solitary man, who spoke so few words, possessed a gentleness she had been starved of her entire life. Her husband had never shown such care to a living thing, least of all to her. A sob escaped her lips, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Caleb looked up, surprised, but she just shook her head and fled back to the cabin, shaken to her very core. Later, the three of them sat in the main room, the rescued calf, wrapped in a blanket, sleeping soundly in a box by the fire. The shared ordeal had created a comfortable silence. It was Caleb who broke it. I had a brother, he said, his voice quiet. Thomas. He was 2 years younger than me. It was the first time he had ever volunteered a story about himself. The women watched him, waiting. When I was 14, our PA took us to work a summer job at the silver mine over in the next county. Just hauling rock, simple work. But there was a tremor. A support beam snapped. His hands clenched on his knees. It happened so fast, a crack, then a roar. I was near the entrance. got thrown clear by the blast of air. But Thomas, he was further in. I saw the rock and timber come down. I saw it." His voice was thick with an old, unprocessed grief. "I just stood there. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Just watched it happen. They said it was instant, that he felt nothing. But I watched. I was his older brother. I was supposed to protect him." He fell silent, the weight of his confession settling in the room. Lottie stared at her hands, her own brutish brother a world away from the boy Caleb described. Evelyn looked at Caleb's profile, at the pain etched around his eyes, and her heart ached with a feeling that was dangerously close to love. He was not just a provider or a protector. He was a man with his own deep well of sorrow. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The image of Caleb's face as he told his story was burned into her mind. She pulled her shawl on and slipped out of the cabin, making her way through the moonlight on the snow to the barn. He was there, checking on the calf one last time. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. She did not say a word. She walked right up to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. She reached up a tentative hand and touched his cheek, his skin rough with stubble. Then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of comfort, of gratitude, of a deep, aching tenderness. It lasted only a moment, before he could react, before he could even process what was happening. She pulled back, turned, and walked out of the barn, leaving him standing alone in the silent cold. The ghost of her touch on his lips. The boundaries had begun to crack. A week later, Caleb was fixing a broken harness when the knife slipped, slicing a deep gash across the palm of his hand. He swore under his breath, wrapping it in his handkerchief, but blood quickly soaked through. Lottie saw it from the porch. She came over with a bowl of clean water and a roll of bandages, her expression all business. "Sit," she ordered. He obeyed, and she began to clean the wound with a practical, no-nonsense touch. Her fingers were calloused and strong, but surprisingly gentle. As she worked, he watched her face, the intense concentration in her stormy eyes. When she was done wrapping the bandage, her hand lingered on his, on impulse. He turned his uninjured hand and gently took her wrist. She flinched, her whole body going rigid, her eyes darting to his, wide with alarm. Her wrist was so slender, so delicate beneath his calloused thumb. It was a place of vulnerability, a map of blue veins under thin skin. He could feel the frantic pulse of her blood. It was the first time he had touched her in a way that was not about work. It was a purely personal, human contact. He saw the fear in her eyes, the memory of another man's unwanted touch. But he also saw a flicker of something else, a yearning. She trembled, but she did not pull away. She held his gaze for a long moment, allowing the touch, before gently withdrawing her hand. Desire, once acknowledged, is a stubborn thing. It began to smolder beneath every glance, in every accidental brush of hands. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken feelings, a dangerous and intoxicating mix of grief, gratitude, and raw, physical wanting. Caleb felt like he was walking on a frozen river, aware of the powerful current moving just beneath the ice. Christmas approached, and with it, an invitation to a town gathering at the church. It was meant to be an evening of carols and community. For them, it was a trial. "We don't have to go," Caleb said. "Yes, we do," Evelyn countered, her chin held high. "We will not be chased into hiding by gossips and hypocrites." Lottie, surprisingly, agreed. "Let 'em stare. I ain't afraid of a few sour faces." So they went. The ride in the wagon was silent and tense. Walking into the church hall felt like walking into a den of wolves. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on them. Caleb, tall and grim-faced, flanked by the graceful, dark-haired widow and the wild-looking, defiant girl. Reverend Miller, holding a cup of cider, saw his moment. He strode to the center of the room, his voice booming with false piety. Friends, as we celebrate the birth of our Savior, let us remember the sanctity of the family, the holy union of one man and one wife. Let us pray for those in our community who have lost their way, who live in defiance of God's law, and bring scandal upon us all. His eyes fixed on Caleb, a look of righteous condemnation on his face. The silence was thick with judgment. Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Before he could speak, Evelyn stepped forward. "Reverend," she said, her voice calm and clear, ringing through the hall. "You speak of God's law. Does not the greatest of his laws command us to love our neighbor, to offer charity and shelter to those in need? Or is your piety reserved only for those whose circumstances you find convenient?" Her words were a perfectly aimed dart, and the preacher flushed, sputtering. Then Lottie, who had been standing rigid as a fence post, spoke up. Her voice was not refined like Evelyn's, but it was raw and powerful. "This man," she said, pointing a finger at Caleb, "took us in when we had nowhere else to go. He gave us shelter from a storm that would have killed us. If that's a sin, then I reckon heaven's emptier than we think." She stared down the crowd, one by one, her gaze so fierce and full of hard-won truth that people began to look away, shuffling their feet in shame. The united, unexpected defense from both women stunned the room into silence. Without another word, Caleb turned and led them out of the hall, their heads held high. The ride home was cloaked in a profound, vibrating silence. The moon was a silver sliver in the inky sky. They sat together on the wagon seat, a small unit against the vast, cold world. The confrontation had bonded them, forging a new alliance in the fire of public shame. As the wagon jolted over a frozen rut, Caleb felt a tentative pressure on his right thigh. He glanced down. It was Evelyn's gloved hand, resting there. It was a quiet claim, an anchor in the dark. He did not move. Moments later, he felt another touch. This one on his left. Lottie's bare hand, calloused and warm, came to rest on his other thigh. Her touch was just as firm, just as possessive. He sat there, driving the horse through the cold night, with a hand from each woman resting on him. They did not withdraw, in the silent darkness, under the diamond-sharp stars. A choice had been made, but it was not his. It was theirs, and the frozen river beneath him had finally begun to crack. The hand on his thigh was a brand, 2 brands, one on each side, marking him in the darkness. The touch did not retreat on the long ride home from the church, and Caleb did not flinch from it. It was a silent pact, a declaration made in the face of the town's judgment. When they arrived back at the homestead, the women withdrew their hands as they climbed down from the wagon, and the spell was broken. But the memory of the warmth remained, a ghost of pressure on his skin. The snows that followed the Christmas gathering were the deepest of the season. The world shrank to the size of the small homestead, a tiny island of life in an endless, silent ocean of white. The path to the barn became a deep trench carved through the drifts. The woodpile dwindled at an alarming rate, a constant, nagging reminder of their finite resources. The trips to town ceased entirely. They were utterly, completely alone. And yet, in that profound isolation, something strange began to grow. The sharp edges of their personalities, worn down by proximity and shared purpose, began to soften. The cabin, once a battlefield of polite hostilities, started to feel like a home. They fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the animals. Caleb would rise first to break the ice in the water troughs. Lottie would follow, her energy a small, fierce fire in the pre-dawn chill, to milk the cow and feed the chickens. Evelyn, who was not made for the bitter cold of the early morning, would have the fire roaring and coffee brewing by the time they came back inside. The smell of it, a welcome promise of warmth and life. Chores that had once been performed as a statement of worth were now simply tasks that needed doing. They moved around one another with an economy of motion that bordered on grace. Lottie, Seeing Evelyn struggle to knead a heavy batch of dough would wordlessly take over, her strong arms working the mass with an easy rhythm. Evelyn, in turn, would notice Lottie's chill-blained hands and leave a pot of soothing salve on her bunk without comment. Once, while carrying a heavy bucket of feed, Caleb slipped on a patch of ice, sending grains scattering across the pristine snow. He let out a curse, his frustration echoing in the cold air. From the barn door, Lottie let out a snort of laughter. It was not a mean sound, but one of pure, unrestrained amusement. Evelyn, coming out of the cabin, saw the scene, Caleb sitting in the snow, covered in feed like a startled chicken, and a genuine, beautiful smile broke across her face. Caleb looked from one laughing woman to the other and felt a grin tug at his own lips. In that moment, they were not a man and his two potential brides. They were just three people, finding a flicker of humor in a hard, relentless world. The long evenings were a crucible of intimacy. With the wind howling outside, there was nowhere to go, nothing to do but be in one another's presence. Caleb would whittle, his knife shaving away curls of wood, filling the air with the clean scent of pine. Evelyn would read to them from the single book she had brought, a collection of poems, her voice a low, melodic counterpoint to the storm. Lottie, who could not read and at first feigned disinterest, soon found herself listening, her hands busy mending a strap or sharpening a tool, her expression distant as if the words were painting pictures in her mind. He began to spend time with them alone, not by design, but by the natural unfolding of the days. He and Lottie would work together in the barn, a comfortable silence between them, punctuated by the sounds of animals and shared labor. He learned the story of her life not through grand confessions, but in small, offhand remarks. A mention of a brother who could charm a snake, a memory of a summer so hot the river dried to a trickle. She understood him in the same way, reading his moods in the set of his shoulders or the way he handled his tools. With Evelyn, the intimacy was one of words. She would join him by the fire after Lottie had gone to bed, and they would talk. She asked him about the stars, and he told her the names his father had taught him. He asked her about Boston, and she described a world of gaslights and cobblestone streets that seemed as distant and strange as the moon. She spoke of art and music, of ideas that had never before entered his quiet life. He found himself listening not just to her words, but to the intelligence and the sorrow that lay beneath them. He swore to himself, in the lonely hours before dawn, that he had to choose. The promise was a stone in his gut. This fragile peace they had built could not last. It was a temporary shelter against the storm, and eventually, the storm would pass. He would lie awake and try to picture his life with just one of them. A life with Evelyn would be orderly, quiet, filled with a gentle civility. The cabin would always be warm, the meals always good, but he could not imagine her out in the fields with him, her hands in the dirt, her face turned to the sun. A life with Lottie would be a partnership of sweat and soil. They would fight the land together, side by side, equals in labor, but he could not imagine her sitting by the fire, reading poetry, her presence a calm anchor in the night. To choose one was to lose the other. The thought was unbearable. Each day that passed, each shared meal, each quiet conversation, braided their lives more tightly together, making the act of separation seem not just difficult, but brutally cruel. The shift between the women happened so quietly Caleb almost missed it. Lottie's birthday was approaching, a fact she mentioned only once, with a dismissive shrug. But Evelyn heard it, for a week, in the quiet moments of the afternoon. Evelyn worked with a pair of knitting needles she had carried with her from the east, and some yarn she had unraveled from a worn-out shawl. On the morning of Lottie's birthday, a soft, woolen scarf, dyed a deep blue with indigo she had found in her trunk, lay folded on the table. Lottie stared at it, her fingers tracing the intricate pattern. It was the first beautiful, useless thing she had ever owned. She didn't say thank you, but she wore the scarf all day, its color a startling slash of brightness against her drab work clothes. A few days later, Lottie disappeared into the workshop for a whole afternoon. She emerged with a small, sturdy stool, the wood sanded smooth, the legs perfectly even. She placed it by the pantry shelves without a word. Evelyn was a tall woman, but the top shelf had always been a struggle for her to reach. Now, it was within easy grasp. The stool was plain, practical, and a profound act of observation and care. The gifts were a silent treaty, an acknowledgement of a bond that had grown in the spaces between their rivalry. One night, the wind returned with a vengeance, bringing with it a storm of freezing rain that coated everything in a thick, treacherous layer of ice. A heavy branch, laden with the weight, cracked and fell, taking the stovepipe with it. Smoke billowed into the cabin, forcing them to douse the fire. The temperature inside plummeted. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the walls, through their clothes, into their very bones. There was nothing for it but to huddle together. They dragged the mattresses from the bunks in Caleb's bed, piling them near the dying embers of the hearth. They lay down under a mountain of every blanket and quilt they possessed. Caleb was in the middle, a bulwark of warmth. After a long, tense silence, he felt Evelyn shift, her body pressing against his side, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. It was a simple, desperate act of seeking warmth across his body. He could feel Lottie, stiff and separate at first, but slowly, as the cold deepened, she too relaxed, her leg brushing against his. He lay there, pinned between them, their combined breath misting in the frigid air, in the faint, rosy glow of the embers. He saw Lottie's eyes open, watching him, watching Evelyn's head on his shoulder. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep, contemplative stillness. The next night, the pipe was fixed, and the fire roared once more. A semblance of normalcy returned. Lottie, exhausted from the tension and the cold, fell asleep early in her bunk. Caleb sat watching the flames, the memory of their bodies pressed against his, still a vivid brand on his consciousness. He got up and walked to the door of their room, intending only to add another log to the small stove in there. Lottie was asleep on the bottom bunk, her face turned toward him. The firelight softened the hard lines of her face, making her look younger, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. The blue scarf was draped over her blanket. On an impulse he did not understand, he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a chaste, gentle kiss, a gesture of protection, of a tenderness he could not voice. He straightened up and turned, and his heart stopped. Evelyn was standing in the doorway, watching him. She had been on the top bunk, awake and silent. Her eyes met his in the dim light, and in them he saw a universe of knowledge and pain. She said nothing. She simply lay back down and turned her face to the wall. The silence of the following day was a screaming thing. Evelyn was polite, remote, her grace a suit of armor he could not penetrate. Caleb felt like a sinner in his own home. He had not betrayed a vow, but he had betrayed a trust, and the fact that it was unspoken made it all the worse. That evening, he retreated to the hayloft, needing to be alone with the clean smell of the hay and the quiet munching of the horses. He needed to think, but his thoughts were a tangled mess. He heard a rustle on the ladder and turned to see Evelyn climbing up, her dark hair haloed by the lantern light. She came and stood before him, her hands clasped, her face pale. "You love her," she said. It was not a question. Caleb's throat was dry. "Evelyn, do you love her more than you could ever love me?" she pressed, her voice trembling but firm. He looked at her, at this woman of grace and sorrow, and he thought of Lottie's fierce, wild spirit. He thought of Evelyn's quiet companionship and Lottie's easy silence. How could he measure one against the other? They were two different kinds of nourishment for two different kinds of hunger. The truth was, he did not know. And his hesitation was an answer in itself. A look of shattering pain crossed her face, followed by a flicker of something else. Desperation, defiance, before he could speak the clumsy words forming in his mind. She closed the distance between them. She put her hands on his chest and pulled him down to her, her mouth finding his. This was not the soft, comforting kiss she had given him before. This was a kiss of raw, desperate hunger. It was a kiss that sought to conquer, to erase, to claim. Her hands tangled in his hair, her body pressed against his, and she whispered the words against his lips, a prayer and a demand. "Make me forget everything," she breathed. "Please, Caleb, just make me forget." And in that moment, faced with the depth of her pain, his own resolve crumbled. He did. He wrapped his arms around her and kissed her back, pouring all his confusion, his loneliness, his own aching need into the act. They sank into the sweet-smelling hay, and the world outside the barn, the snow, the promise, the other woman, ceased to exist. The next morning, guilt was a physical sickness in his stomach. He could not look at Lottie. He busied himself with outside chores, avoiding the cabin, avoiding her eyes. But she knew. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a tangible thing on his back. She did not need to have seen. She could sense the change in the air, in the way he moved, in the way Evelyn now avoided her gaze as well. The day passed in a strained, miserable silence. That night, Caleb retreated to the stables, the company of the horses a balm to his shredded conscience. He was brushing down his mare when Lottie appeared in the wide barn doorway, a silhouette against the snow-lit night. She walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She was trembling, and as she came into the lantern light, he saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the rapid pulse in her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, thick with hurt and a terrible, raw need. "You gave her your mouth," she said, her stormy eyes locked on his. "In the hayloft, I know." She took a shuddering breath, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Now you give me the rest." It was not a plea. It was a demand for a justice that was brutal and fair. It was a demand to be seen, to be touched, to be held with the same desperate intensity. He saw in her face all the years of being second best, of being unwanted, of fighting for scraps. He saw her pain, and it mirrored his own guilt. He reached out a hand and wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. She closed her eyes at the touch, leaning into his hand for a brief moment. Then her eyes opened again, blazing with a fierce, desperate light. She launched herself at him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her mouth crashing against his. The passion was nothing like the sorrowful surrender with Evelyn. This was a storm. It was fierce, angry, aching. It was a fight for purchase in a world that had given her none. Her hands clawed at his shirt, her body molded against his. Not in a plea for comfort, but in an act of claiming what she believed was hers by right. He held her just as tightly, his guilt and his own long-repressed desires erupting in a wave of raw, physical need. This was not about forgetting. It was about feeling everything. Afterward, they lay in the straw, their bodies slick with sweat, the cold air a shock against their skin. And in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the soft sounds of the sleeping animals, they both cried, not loud, wrenching sobs, but the quiet, hopeless tears of two people who had just crossed a line from which they knew they could never return. Caleb woke to the biting cold of a false dawn, the kind that promised no warmth, only a lighter shade of gray. He lay still in the hay, the scent of it filling his nostrils, a clean, earthy smell that was suddenly corrupted by the memory of what had transpired there. Two separate memories, a night apart, that had bled into one another, creating a single, monstrous transgression. Guilt was not a thought or a feeling. It was a physical weight on his chest, a foul taste in his mouth. He had not simply crossed a line, he had obliterated it, leaving the landscape of their lives scorched and unrecognizable. He rose and dressed in the frigid darkness, his movements stiff. He could not face them. Not yet. He fled to the barn, to the mindless, rhythmic work that had always been his solace. He forked hay, broke the ice in the water trough, his breath crystallizing in the air. But the work brought no peace. Every shadow seemed to hold the ghost of Evelyn's desperate whisper. Every rustle of straw, the echo of Lottie's ragged sob. He was a man adrift, his own moral compass shattered. He had taken their pain and their need and used it to soothe his own loneliness, and in doing so, had wounded them both more deeply. Breakfast was an agony of silence. The air in the cabin was so thick with unspoken words it was hard to breathe. Evelyn moved with a brittle, apathetic grace, her face a pale, polite mask that betrayed nothing. Lottie was a storm cloud hunched over her plate, her fork scraping against the tin with a violence that made Caleb's teeth ache. He ate without tasting, the food turning to ash in his mouth. He could feel their eyes on him. Not at the same time, but in succession. Evelyn's filled with a kind of sorrowful accusation. Lottie's blazing with a raw, furious hurt. He was a thief who had stolen something precious from each of them. And they all sat together at the table, staring at the empty space where it had been. He could not endure it. He needed distance. He needed the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains to swallow his confusion, to let him think. The snows had finally begun to recede. The trail to town a treacherous but passable track of mud and ice. He pushed his plate away, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "The pass is clear enough," he announced to the space between them. "I'm taking the 2 oldest steers into town. We're low on flour and salt." It was a lie, and they all knew it. They had enough to last another month. He was running. Evelyn looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Lottie continued to stare at her plate, her jaw working. She did not look at him, but he felt her knowledge of his cowardice like a physical blow. He gathered his gear, the simple actions of saddling his horse a welcome distraction. He did not look back at the cabin as he rode away. He could not bear to see the 2 figures who would surely be watching from the window. 2 women he had bound to himself and to each other in a terrible, tangled knot. Inside the cabin, the silence Caleb left behind was heavier still. For an hour, the women moved around the small space, a careful, wide orbit, not speaking, not looking at one another. The tension stretched and thinned until it was a wire, humming with a painful frequency. It was Evelyn who finally broke it. She was washing the breakfast plates, her movements jerky, when a dish slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound was like a gunshot. Lottie, who was sharpening an axe blade by the hearth, flinched. Evelyn stared at the broken pieces, her shoulders slumping, and a dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. "Just leave it," Lottie said, her voice rough. "I cannot do anything right," Evelyn whispered, more to herself than to Lottie. She knelt, her hands hovering over the sharp fragments as if she meant to pick them up with her bare fingers. "Stop," Lottie commanded, her voice sharp enough to make Evelyn freeze. "You'll cut yourself to ribbons." Lottie got the broom and dustpan and began sweeping up the mess with quick, efficient strokes. Evelyn remained on the floor, her composure finally shattered like the plate. "He was with you," she said, her voice flat. "In the barn, after he was with me." Lottie did not stop sweeping. "He was... Do you hate me?" The question was raw, stripped of all artifice. Lottie finally stopped and looked at her, really looked at her, at the proud, sad woman crumpled on the floor. "I did," she said with brutal honesty. "I hated you for your soft hands and your fancy words. I hated you for the way he looked at you, like you were some kind of puzzle he wanted to solve. But I don't think I have the energy for it anymore." She dumped the shards into the fire, where they popped and sizzled in the heat. She sat down in the chair opposite Evelyn. The air between them was suddenly clear, the storm having broken. "He touched you first," Lottie stated. Her eyes narrowed. Evelyn flinched but met her gaze. "Yes." "Why?" The simple question seemed to undo Evelyn completely. "Because I am a coward," she confessed. the words tearing from her. Because I saw him look at you, at your strength. I see the way you handle this life, the way you belong in it. You are sturdy. You are rooted. I am a vine that was cut, and I do not know how to grow new roots. I am not strong enough for this place. For him. She looked at her own hands, soft and pale despite the work. My whole life, I was trained to be pleasing, to be a wife, but my husband's house was a prison, and this place requires a strength I do not possess. When he looked at you, I thought he had made his choice, and I wanted him to make me forget what it felt like to be left behind again. Lottie listened, her expression unreadable. She had always seen Evelyn as an obstacle, a rival of infuriating grace and refinement. She had never once considered that beneath the surface lay a terror as profound as her own. "So you just took him?" Lottie asked, a note of grudging awe in her voice. "I was desperate," Evelyn whispered. Lottie shook her head, a strange, bitter smile on her lips. "You don't know a thing about desperation, but you know how to get what you want. I'll give you that." She leaned forward, her stormy eyes intense. "You think I'm so strong? You think this is easy for me? My whole life, people have looked at me and seen a pair of hands for work or a body for taking. That's it. No one's ever looked at me and seen someone to be chosen." The word was poison in her mouth. "I don't know how to be chosen. Mrs. Winslow. I only know how to fight. I saw him with you, and I knew what you'd done, and I thought, if he can give her comfort for her sadness, then he can give me something for my anger. I wanted him to look at me, just once, and see me. Not my hands, not my hunger. Me." They sat in silence for a long time. The truth of their confessions laid bare between them. Two women, broken in different ways by the world of men, who had sought solace in the same arms and found only more complication. "I am sorry," Evelyn said finally, her voice clear, "for my part in your pain." Lottie gave a short, sharp nod. "It ain't your fault. It ain't mine. It might not even be his. It just is. This whole mess just is." A respect, born not of affection but of a shared, painful honesty, had taken root in the ruins of their rivalry. They were not friends, but they were no longer enemies. They were two sides of the same impossible equation. Caleb was gone for 3 days. The time in town was a blur of noise and forced pleasantries. He sold the cattle, bought the supplies, and fended off the sly questions and knowing looks from the men in the saloon. The space he had sought did not clear his head. It only amplified the silence of the homestead, making him acutely aware of what he had left behind. He was a fool for thinking he could outrun his own heart. He returned with a heavy spirit, his choice no clearer than when he had left. As he rode up the track, he saw them. They were outside, working together to mend a section of fence that had collapsed under the snow. Evelyn was holding the post steady, while Lottie tamped the earth around it with a heavy beam. They moved with a synchronized purpose, a team. They stopped when they saw him, and he saw it in their eyes at once. Something had changed. The air was no longer charged with hostility, but with a quiet, uneasy truth. They looked at him not as a prize or a judge, but as the third, troubled corner of their triangle. That night, the tension returned, but it was of a different kind. It was a silence of anticipation, after a supper eaten with a formal, strained politeness. Caleb knew the time had come. He could not run anymore. He could not let this wound fester. He had to make his decision. He had to restore some kind of order, no matter how painful. "Meet me in the barn," he said, his voice low. "When you're ready." He went ahead, lighting a fire in the small, pot-bellied stove. He did not want to do this in the suffocating closeness of the cabin. The barn was a larger space, a more honest one. He stood by the fire, rehearsing the words, the kind, final, brutal words he would have to say to one of them. He felt like an executioner. He heard their footsteps on the hard-packed earth. They entered together, their faces pale and serious in the flickering firelight. They stood before him, not close to one another, but as a united front. The sight of them, so resolute and grave, stole the words from his mouth. He opened his mouth to speak, to begin the terrible process of choosing. "Evelyn, Lottie, I—" But before he could form the sentence, Evelyn moved. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sadness, and she let the woolen shawl she wore slip from her shoulders. It pooled at her feet in a soft, dark heap. She stood before him in her simple dress, stripped of her last layer of protection. Then Lottie, her gaze locked with his, her expression a mixture of defiance and vulnerability, reached up and slowly, deliberately, began to unlace the bodice of her dress. The rough fabric parted, and she let it fall loose, a gesture of profound and radical surrender. Caleb stared, his mind reeling, his carefully prepared speech dissolving into dust. "Don't speak yet," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling but clear. She took a step forward, into the space between them. "We already chose." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold, on his other side. Lottie stepped forward and took his other hand, her palm calloused and warm. They stood there, a chain of 3 people, bound by their shared history of pain and desire. Evelyn leaned in and kissed him, a kiss not of passion, but of acceptance. Then she pulled back, and Lottie took her place, her own kiss fierce and full of a desperate truth. And then the unthinkable happened. Evelyn reached out a hand, not to him, but to Lottie, her fingers gently touching the other woman's cheek. Lottie did not flinch. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch. It was a gesture of truce, of forgiveness, of a solidarity that defied every rule of the world they knew. What followed was not a frenzy of passion, but a slow, quiet unfolding. It was a moment of profound and deeply human surrender. It was not about lust. It was about the desperate, aching need to be whole. It was about taking the broken pieces of 3 shattered lives and seeing if they could be fitted together to make something new. They sank into the hay, not as a man and his lovers, but as 3 souls seeking a sanctuary from their loneliness. It was a healing, a wordless prayer offered up in the silent, holy space of the barn. They fell asleep tangled together in the straw, their limbs entwined, their breathing slow and even. The fire in the stove burned down to embers, and outside, the stars wheeled across the cold, uncaring sky. No words had been spoken, because no words were necessary. Caleb woke just before dawn, a shaft of pale gray light slanting through a gap in the barn boards. Evelyn's head was on his shoulder, her dark hair spilling across his chest. Lottie's arm was flung across his waist, her hand resting near his heart. They were both still sound asleep. He looked at them, at these 2 fiercely different women, and a feeling of awe washed over him. The choice he had been agonizing over now seemed like a foolish, arrogant delusion. The world demanded a choice, an answer, a neat and tidy line. But life, in its raw and messy truth, had offered up something else entirely. He needed to talk, to understand what this meant. As the women began to stir, he sat up. "Evelyn," he started, his voice a rough croak. "Lottie, we have to—" But what? What did they have to do? They looked at him, their eyes soft with sleep, and the simple, impossible truth of their situation settled over him. The choice no longer made sense. It was then that he heard it, the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, approaching fast. He stood up, pulling on his trousers, a sense of cold dread creeping up his spine. The world was not going to leave them to their peace. He reached the barn door just as they rode into the yard. It was a grim procession of 4 men from the town, led by Reverend Miller, his face a mask of smug righteousness. Caleb recognized the man who rode beside him, a merchant from back east, a man who had known Evelyn and her husband. The man's eyes were filled with a particular kind of venom. The preacher reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the barn, over Caleb's disheveled state, and landing on the two women who now stood in the doorway behind him, wrapped in blankets. A cruel, triumphant smile touched his lips. "Caleb Whitmore," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cold morning air. "We have come in the name of God and decency. This scandal ends today. You will cast one of these women out. You will choose one to be your wife and send the other away from this valley, forever." The preacher's words hung in the cold air, sharp and heavy as icicles. The demand was an ultimatum, a blade held to the throat of the fragile new world they had just begun to build. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the snorting of the horses and the low, menacing crackle of the fire from the cabin. Caleb stepped forward, planting his feet firmly on the frozen ground. He positioned himself squarely in front of the two women, a human shield. "This is my land, Reverend," he said, his voice a low growl that held more menace than a shout. "These women are under my protection. You have no business here." "I have God's business here," Miller retorted, his face flushing with righteous fury. "And the law's Mr. Davies here," he gestured to the elder beside him, "has reminded me that the original deed to this homestead contains a morality clause. The land was granted on the condition that it be a place of decent, Christian living. What you are doing here is a flagrant violation. The town council has the right to declare your claim forfeit." The threat was real. The ranch, the only thing his father had left him, the only thing he had in the world, could be taken away. He felt a cold dread snake through him, but it was quickly consumed by a hot, defiant rage. Before he could answer, Evelyn stepped out from behind him. She had pulled the blanket around her like a queen's robe, her posture ramrod straight, her face a mask of cold fury. "There is no need to threaten Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice cutting through the air, sharp and clear as glass. "This situation is my fault. I will leave. I will be packed and gone within the hour." She was already a pariah. She would not drag him down with her. "No," a rough voice cut in. Lottie moved to stand beside Evelyn, her own blanket clutched in a white-knuckled fist, her chin jutting out. "You ain't going nowhere. I'm the one who don't belong. I'll go." She had arrived with nothing. She would leave with nothing. It was a familiar story. "No!" The word ripped from Caleb's throat, a roar of pure, untamed frustration. It silenced everyone. The horses shied at the sound. He turned, his eyes blazing, and looked at the two women who stood ready to sacrifice themselves. "Neither of you is leaving. This is your home. Now get inside." His voice was a command, absolute and final. He turned back to the riders. "Get off my land," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Now." There was something in his eyes, a look of a man pushed past his limit, that made even Reverend Miller hesitate. After a long, tense moment, the preacher gave a curt nod. The posse turned their horses and rode away, leaving a trail of churned mud and unspoken threats behind them. That night, the cabin was a tomb. The victory in the yard felt hollow, a temporary stay of execution. They ate in silence, the food tasteless, the threat of losing the land, of having their fragile existence torn apart, hung over them like a shroud. After the meal, Caleb retreated outside, needing to walk, to feel the cold air on his face. Inside, the women sat by the fire, the silence stretching between them. Evelyn stared into the flames, her face etched with a familiar, weary resignation. She was the source of the scandal, the poison that tainted everything. It was the story of her life. Lottie watched her, saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way the fight had gone out of her. Slowly, deliberately, Lottie reached across the small space between their chairs and took Evelyn's hand. Evelyn flinched at the unexpected contact, her head snapping up. Lottie's hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a worker. It was so different from her own, but it was firm, and it was warm. Lottie's grip was not one of pity, but of solidarity. "We ain't broken," Lottie said, her voice low but fierce. "Not anymore." Evelyn looked at their joined hands, then into Lottie's stormy, resolute eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that was not fear, but strength, a strength that was not her own, but borrowed, shared. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. She squeezed Lottie's hand in return. When Caleb came back inside, he found them like that, sitting in silence, their hands clasped. The sight stopped him in his tracks. They were no longer two rivals. They were allies, a new kind of family forged in the crucible of the town's hatred. And in that moment, seeing them together, a radical, impossible idea began to form in his mind. He pulled a chair up, his movements heavy with purpose. "They can take the land," he said, his voice flat. "The law might be on their side." "Then what will we do?" Evelyn asked, her voice a whisper. Caleb looked from her face to Lottie's. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I will not be the one who casts either of you out. If the world demands a choice, then I choose to defy the world." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "The deed is in my name, Caleb Whitmore, one man. But what if it wasn't?" They stared at him, uncomprehending. "I'll ride to the county seat," he said, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "I'll see a lawyer. I'll have the deed redrawn. I'll divide the land into 3 equal parts. 1 part for Caleb Whitmore, 1 for Evelyn Winslow, and 1 for Lottie Ray. 1 home, 3 names. Let the law figure that out. Let the world watch." It was a shocking, insane proposal. It was an act of open rebellion. To put a woman's name on a deed was rare enough. To put 2 on, alongside a man to whom they were not married, was unheard of. It was a declaration of war against every convention they knew. Evelyn's breath hitched. Lottie's eyes widened. A flicker of disbelief. Then a slow-burning fire, lighting their depths. It was the most radical act of respect either of them had ever been shown. He was not choosing between them. He was choosing both of them, and himself, as equals. The following week, the summons came. It was not a legal document from the county seat, but a letter from the town council, delivered by a grim-faced boy. They were to appear at the church hall for an informal hearing. It was a trial by another name, a public shaming disguised as civic duty. The hall was packed. It felt as though the entire town had turned out to witness their humiliation. The air was thick with whispers, with the scent of self-righteousness and morbid curiosity. They walked to the front and stood before the council, Reverend Miller, Mr. Davies, and 3 other grim-faced elders. The proceeding was a farce. There were no rules of evidence, only accusations and innuendo. But it was not the elders they had to face. It was their own pasts, which had been dragged into the light for the town's entertainment. A woman stood up in the crowd. She was elegantly dressed, her face familiar to Evelyn. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman who had once called herself Evelyn's friend in Boston, the wife of her late husband's business partner. She was visiting family in the territory, a cruel twist of fate. It was she who had brought the full story of Evelyn's shame west with her. "I knew this woman in a better life," Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with pity and malice. "When she was the respected wife of a great man. But even then, there was a coldness to her, a barrenness of spirit. It is no surprise to see her fall to such a level, seeking comfort in a place of sin and squalor. She has disgraced the memory of her husband." Evelyn stood there, forced to listen to the lies that had driven her from her home. She felt the old shame, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear. But then she felt Lottie's presence beside her, solid and unyielding. She looked at Caleb, who watched her with a quiet, steady confidence. She was no longer the frightened widow from Boston. She walked directly up to Mrs. Gable, her steps measured and calm. She stood before her old friend, and for a moment, the hall was utterly silent. "You speak of my husband's memory," Evelyn said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "You never knew the man. You only knew the monument he built for the world to see. I was the one who had to live in its shadow." Then she did something the graceful, pleasing Mrs. Winslow would never have done. She drew back her hand and slapped the woman across the face. The crack of the blow echoed like a gunshot. "Mrs." Gable gasped, her hand flying to her cheek, her face a mask of shock and outrage. Without another word, Evelyn turned her back on the woman and walked back to her place, her head held high. A chain had been broken. She was free. The council, stunned, called for order. It was then that a man pushed his way through the crowd from the back of the hall. He was a big, burly man with a sullen face and Lottie's stormy eyes. "That's my sister," he snarled, pointing a thick finger at Lottie. "Jed Ray. I heard she'd taken up with a sinner out here. I've come to take her home, where she belongs." Lottie went rigid. This was the brother who had stood by while their father drank himself to death, who had done nothing to protect her. He represented the life of hunger and hopelessness she had fled. "I ain't going anywhere with you, Jed," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You'll do as you're told," he said, taking a step toward her. "You've brought shame on our name." "What name?" Lottie shot back, her fear transmuting into a white-hot fury. "A name you never did a thing to honor. You let Pa die. You let us starve. You have no claim on me." She stood her ground, her small frame radiating a strength that made her seem twice her size. "This is my home now. These are my people." Jed lunged for her, but Caleb moved in an instant, blocking his path. He did not touch him. He just stood there, a silent, immovable wall. Jed, a bully and a coward, faltered. He looked from Caleb's stony face to his sister's defiant one, and with a curse, he turned and shoved his way back out of the hall. Lottie stood tall, breathing heavily, having faced down the ghost of her past and won. The hearing was in chaos. Reverend Miller, seeing his public trial unraveling, made his final move. "This is a mockery," he declared. "The council finds that Caleb Whitmore is in violation of the morality clause. We will begin proceedings to have his deed revoked." A gasp went through the crowd. Caleb felt the floor drop out from under him. He had lost. His rebellion had cost him everything. But then a new voice spoke, dry and cracked with age. "You'll do no such thing, Miller." An old man, Silas Croft, one of the original settlers in the valley, slowly got to his feet. He was a respected figure, a man who rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. "I was here when Caleb's father built that homestead with his own 2 hands, Silas said, his voice raspy but clear. "And I was here 4 years ago when the fever swept through this town. My wife was sick. My son was sick. I was down in my back and couldn't work. We were near to starving. And who was it that brought us a side of beef and a sack of flour and asked for nothing in return? It wasn't you, Reverend. It was this boy right here." He pointed a gnarled finger at Caleb. "He did it quiet-like, 'cause he's not a man for show. This valley was built on neighbors helping neighbors, not on prying into a man's home and calling it God's work. If you take this boy's land, you spit on the grave of every pioneer who settled this place. You can count me out of your righteous little mob." He sat down. A murmur went through the crowd. Others remembered. They remembered Caleb's quiet acts of kindness, his father's reputation for honesty. The town was no longer a single, condemning voice. It was divided. The council's authority, built on a foundation of unified judgment, had crumbled. Miller, his face pale with fury, knew he had been beaten. The trial was over. They returned home under a sky bruised with the colors of sunset. They were exhausted, battered, but they were whole. They had walked through the fire and had not been consumed. That night, they built a small bonfire in the yard. The air was still and cold. Evelyn went into the cabin and came back with a small, leather-bound book, her late husband's diary. "He wrote in it every night," she said, her voice quiet. "He detailed everything. My transgressions, my punishments." She held it out. "I've carried it with me all this time. Proof, I suppose, in case anyone ever accused me of being a liar." She looked from Caleb to Lottie. "I don't need it anymore." Lottie took the diary from her. Without a word, she opened it and tossed it into the heart of the fire. The brittle pages caught at once. The neat, cruel script of a dead man curling into black ash and rising up into the star-filled sky. They stood together and watched it burn, a final, shared ritual of cleansing. When the last page was gone, Caleb stepped forward. He reached out and gently cupped each woman's face in his hands, his touch full of a reverence he had never felt before. He kissed Evelyn's forehead, then Lottie's. They were soft, gentle kisses, not of passion, but of a deep and abiding peace. "We survived," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze encompassing them both. "But now we live." The long winter of the soul finally broke. Spring did not arrive gently in that high country. It came in a rush, a violent and beautiful thaw. The snow, which had been their jailer for months, receded from the hard-packed earth, leaving behind the rich, dark scent of mud and new life. The creek, once a silent sheet of ice, roared with the fury of melted snow, its voice a triumphant shout. Green shoots, impossibly delicate and fiercely determined, pushed their way through the thawing soil. The world, which had been a stark canvas of white and gray, was suddenly alive with color and sound. The change in the land mirrored the change in the small cabin. The heavy, suffocating silence of winter was replaced by a new rhythm. They had survived. Now, as Caleb had said, it was time to live, and living, they discovered, was in the small, everyday work of building something together. Their first project was a garden, the patch of land behind the cabin, which Caleb had long neglected, became their shared focus. They were a strange and effective team. Evelyn, it turned out, had a deep, theoretical knowledge of horticulture, gleaned from books she had read in her past life. She knew which plants would thrive in the thin mountain soil, how to space the seeds, and when to plant by the phases of the moon. She became the architect of their small plot, her instructions delivered in a quiet, confident voice that held none of her former fragility. Lottie was the raw, untamed energy. She loved the feel of the earth, the way the cool dirt crumbled in her hands. She dug the rows with a fierce, tireless strength, her back bending to the task as if she had been born for it. Where Evelyn's knowledge was of the mind, Lottie's was of the body, an intuitive understanding of the soil and its secrets. Caleb was the foundation. He broke the stubborn, rocky ground with a pickaxe, his muscles straining in the warm sun. He hauled buckets of water from the creek, his strength a steady, reliable current that fed their efforts. And in the midst of this shared labor, they began to laugh. It started as small chuckles, but soon grew into full, open-throated laughter. Lottie, trying to dislodge a stubborn rock, accidentally flung a spray of mud that splattered across Caleb's cheek. He stopped, stunned for a moment, before a slow grin spread across his face. He reached down, scooped up a handful of wet earth, and gently dabbed it on the end of her nose. Evelyn, watching from the edge of the garden, let out a peal of laughter so pure and joyful it startled them all. It was the sound of a spring thaw all its own. Their trips to Harmony Creek were different now. The open hostility had mostly faded, replaced by a wary, grudging curiosity. The whispers still followed them down the main street, but they were less venomous, more speculative. The story of the town meeting had spread, and Silas Croft's public defense had given others permission to soften their judgment. Some townsfolk would give Caleb a curt, respectful nod. The women, for the most part, still shunned Evelyn and Lottie, pulling their children close and turning their backs as they passed. But the solid wall of condemnation had been breached. The first true sign of hope came on a bright Tuesday afternoon. A quiet knock came at the cabin door. Caleb opened it to find Martha Croft, Silas's wife, a woman as quiet and sturdy as her husband. She was holding a bundle wrapped in a clean dishcloth. She did not say a word. She simply held out the bundle to Evelyn, her eyes wrinkled at the corners from a lifetime of squinting into the sun, holding a look of simple, human kindness. Evelyn took the offering, and the woman gave a small, shy smile, turned, and walked away. Inside the cloth was a loaf of sourdough bread, still warm from the oven. They stood in the cabin, the three of them, looking at the loaf as if it were a miracle. It was more than just bread. It was a message. It was an offering of peace, a thread of community extended to their small, strange island. That night, they ate the bread with their supper, and it tasted of acceptance. The changing season brought a change within the women as well. One afternoon, Caleb came in from the fields to find Evelyn sitting at the table, a pen in her hand, a sheet of fine paper before her. She was writing a letter to her sister back east. He knew it was the first contact she had made with her family since she had fled. He watched her for a moment, the way her hand moved across the page, not with the hesitant, fearful script of a victim, but with the steady, confident flow of a woman telling her own story, on her own terms. She was no longer running from her past. She was facing it, reaching back to it from a place of unassailable strength. An even more profound transformation was happening with Lottie, the girl who had arrived barefoot and defiant, who wore her illiteracy like a suit of armor, began to soften. One night, as Evelyn read aloud by the fire, Lottie interrupted her. "That word," she said, pointing a calloused finger at the page. "What does it look like?" Evelyn stopped, and a slow, gentle smile touched her lips. "It looks like this," she said, and she traced the letters for her. From that night on, a new ritual began. After the chores were done, after the sun had set, Lottie would sit beside Evelyn at the table, a child's primer that Caleb had bought in town open before them, with a patience that amazed him. Evelyn guided Lottie through the mysterious, magical world of letters. He would watch them from his chair, the firelight catching the gold in Lottie's bent head, the quiet satisfaction on Evelyn's face. He was witnessing the birth of a friendship so unlikely and so powerful it felt sacred. One day, Caleb took his sharpest knife and stood before the heavy wooden doorpost of the cabin. He was tired of the whispers, tired of the ambiguity that clung to them. Their life was real, and it deserved a name. He began to carve, the blade biting deep into the seasoned pine. First, he carved his own name, in plain, block letters, Caleb Whitmore. Then, directly beneath it, with the same care, he carved Evelyn Winslow, and finally, giving it the same space, the same permanence, he carved Lottie Ray. He stepped back and looked at his work. 3 names. Not a man and his property, but 3 individuals, declared as a single, indivisible unit. It was a quiet, defiant monument, a testament carved in wood. When the women saw it, they did not speak. Evelyn traced the letters of her name with a trembling finger, her eyes shining. Lottie stood with her arms crossed, but a slow, proud smile spread across her face. The doorpost now told the truth of who they were. The land continued to test them. That summer was a season of violent storms that swept down from the mountains with little warning. One night, a tempest of incredible fury descended upon the homestead. The wind howled like a banshee, and lightning split the sky, illuminating the world in brief, terrifying flashes. In the midst of the storm, they heard it, a sound of groaning, splintering wood, followed by a deafening crash that shook the cabin to its foundations. The next morning, they saw the devastation. The old barn, the one his father had built, had collapsed. A lightning strike had shattered the main support beam, and the fierce wind had done the rest. It was a heap of splintered timbers and ruined hay. For a moment, they stood before the wreckage in stunned silence. The barn had been the heart of the homestead, a symbol of its endurance. To see it destroyed felt like a terrible omen. But as he looked at the two women standing beside him, Caleb felt no despair. He saw the same grim determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. They had faced down shame, poverty, and hatred. They would not be defeated by a pile of broken wood. The rebuilding of the barn became the focus of their lives for the rest of the summer. It was grueling, back-breaking work. They salvaged what timber they could and felled new trees from the woods behind the ranch. Caleb, with his knowledge of carpentry, directed the work. Lottie, with her tireless strength, hauled and lifted, her muscles straining. Evelyn, surprisingly, proved to be meticulous and precise, her sharp eyes ensuring every joint was flush, every angle true. They worked from sunup to sundown, covered in sawdust and sweat, their hands blistered, their bodies aching, but they worked as one, a single unit, their movements and thoughts synchronized, and the new barn that rose from the wreckage was stronger, sturdier, and built on a foundation not just of wood and stone, but of their shared will. A year passed, a full circle of seasons since the night in the barn that had changed everything. The night the world had demanded a choice, and they had refused to make it. One evening, as the first chill of autumn sharpened the air, Caleb called the women out to the new porch he had built. He was holding a small, buckskin pouch. He looked at them, at the two women who had remade his world, his heart so full he could barely speak. "A year ago tonight," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I had to make a choice. I was a fool." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. Lying there were two rings. They were not made of gold or silver, but were carved from a single piece of dark, polished oak, salvaged from the heart of a beam from the old barn. The grain of the wood flowed seamlessly from one ring to the other. "I still do not know what to call this," he said, his gaze moving from Evelyn to Lottie and back again. "The world has no name for it, but I know that it is real. I know that it is my life." He held out his hand. "I am not asking you to be my brides. I am asking you to be my partners. In this home, in this life, in whatever comes next." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she looked at the simple, beautiful ring. She held out her hand, and Caleb slipped it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Then he turned to Lottie. Her stormy eyes were soft. Her lips parted in a look of stunned wonder. She, who had never been given anything but hardship, held out her own calloused hand. He slid the second ring onto her finger. They did not accept as wives standing behind a husband. They accepted as equals, as partners in something larger and more profound than any vow the world could recognize. The story closes on a quiet night, much later. 3 sturdy chairs sat on the porch of the cabin, facing the vast, open horizon. 3 people sat in them, watching the last vestiges of sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. A comfortable, easy silence rested between them. Then, a hand reached out, and then another, and their fingers intertwined. Caleb's large, strong hand, Evelyn's slender, graceful one, and Lottie's tough, capable one. A chain of 3, unbreakable. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped, looking out at the darkening land, at a future that held no guarantees, only a wild, shared promise. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Please feel free to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.